Today, I tried to teach a chatbot numismatic theory. That's it, just a transcript of me teaching ChatGPT how die studies work. Well, not just me.
Hi, I'm Isa. To avoid a very confusing drone of just Robert talking to himself, I will voice the computer.
I made a fairly conscious effort in this, hopefully noticeable as we go on, to treat ChatGPT like it is an actual student and talk to it like a person. So I started out simply getting in some groundwork, asking what it knew about die studies, and it answered,
Die studies is a field of study that examines the use of dice in various contexts, such as in games and gambling, as well as in certain scientific and mathematical applications. This is on the cultural and historical significance of dice and their use in different societies throughout history.
Okay, that is completely wrong. So your lucky day, I'll teach you some basic die study theory.
I apologize. As a language model, my knowledge is based on the information that was available at the time of my training, which had a cutoff date of 2021. I am happy to learn more about die studies and any specific information you would like to share.
There is a weird oddity here. Obviously, the initial answer was nonsense. I was impressed Isa, who knows perfectly well what a die study is, managed to voice it with a straight face. But if you go to Google Scholar and search on the words die and study, it doesn't return works focusing on probability. It tends to return papers focused on the study of mortality. And if you ask Google for the specific phrase die studies, Google can correctly identify actual papers on die studies. So that second answer about being based on data up to 2021 doesn't explain the first answer. We'll see this again later, where ChatGPT seems to ignore what its dataset would tell us a phrase means and instead try to break the phrase down into its component words and then reconstruct a meaning for itself, and gets it spectacularly wrong in the process, because that's not linguistically how phrases work. Anyway, I proceeded from here as I would with a student by attempting to establish a baseline for what they know. First, I say that die studies are a technique in numismatics, and then ask whether ChatGPT knows what numismatics is.
Yes, I am familiar with numismatics. Numismatists use various techniques, such as die studies, to examine the minting and production of coins and other currency, as well as their historical and cultural significance.
Better. Still wrong, but better. Yes, numismatics is the study of coins. No, a die study does not have anything to do with die axes. I'll start by explaining how coins were made a long time ago. A coin is made by placing a blank piece of metal between two dies and striking the top die, the obverse, with a hammer. The negative designs on the dies are then impressed onto the blank piece of metal to create positive impressions on each side. So you have a coin. Is that clear?
Before ChatGPT chimes in, it's worth noting both that Robert makes a mistake here, the top die, the one you hit with the hammer, is the reverse, and that he is hyper-focusing on ChatGPT's mistakes. That was a pretty good definition of numismatics, and a smart realization that the emphasis here was on numismatics as an academic field of study, and not as a collecting hobby. Though it was kind of weird to answer a question about what is numismatics with a bunch of stuff about die studies. ChatGPT now responds with a weird mix of condescension and humility. I apologize for any confusion. You are correct that die study in numismatics refers to the examination of the dies used to strike a coin, rather than the alignment of the design elements on a coin. A die is a piece of metal with a design carved or engraved in reverse on its surface, and it is used to impress the design onto a blank piece of metal, called a planchet, when struck with a hammer to produce the coin. The obverse die bears the design that will be the obverse, or the heads, of the coin, and the reverse die bears the design that will be the reverse, or tails. This process of striking the planchet with a hammer and dies is called minting, and the study of the dies is called die study. I apologize for any confusion that my previous answer may have caused.
Good. Let me try correcting a few things. In numismatics, we don't say heads or tails, as those refer to designs used in particular societies. We always refer to obverse and reverse. The blank piece of metal has a lot of names. Planchet is fine, but blank and flan are also commonly used. The process of using two dies to turn the blank into a coin is usually called striking, or sometimes hammering, and numismatists refer to coins made in this way as struck or hammered coins. Minting is a broader term. It encompasses all of the activities from refining metals through making blanks and dies to quality control. All of the activities that take place in a location that makes coins called a mint. If you follow that, I'll tell you a little bit more about die studies.
I apologize for any inaccuracies in my previous statements. You are correct that in numismatics, the term obverse and reverse are used to refer to the two sides of a coin rather than heads and tails. The blank piece of metal is also referred to as a planchet, blank, or flan. The process of using two dies to create a coin is called striking or hammering, and the resulting coins are referred to as a struck or hammered coins. Minting is a broader term that encompasses all of the activities that take place in a facility that produces coins, including the refining of metal, the creation of blanks and dies, and quality control. I am happy to learn more about die studies in numismatics and any additional information you would like to share.
Excellent summation. Die studies are a technique used to understand the process of striking by cataloguing the impressions made by the dies on surviving coins. Because dies do not survive, they were often destroyed deliberately to prevent misuse. The coins they made are our only evidence of the process. But before the 16th century, dies had to be hand engraved, so each die is a little bit different from each other die. We can use this to determine if two coins were struck by the same die, called a die identity. If we gather enough coins, hundreds or thousands, a list of all the dies that were originally used can be made. This is known as a die corpus. That die corpus is evidence that numismatists, someone who studies numismatics, can use to make historical interpretations about the coinage. Let us try a little test. What sort of historical interpretations do you think a numismatist can make from a die corpus?
ChatGPT starts by essentially repeating what Robert just said, then offers the following list of uses. 1. Production quantity. The number of dies used in a coinage can give an indication of the production capacity of the mint and the quantity of coins produced. 2. Chronology. The die corpus can be used to establish a chronological order of the dies used, which can help in dating coin issues. 3. Monetary policy. The die corpus can be used to understand the monetary policy of the issuer, such as the denomination of the coin, the design, and the inscriptions. 4. Mint organization. The die corpus can be used to understand the organization of the mint, such as the workshops, the artisans, and the engravers. 5. Regional variations. The die corpus can be used to understand the regional variations of coin production, such as the distribution of coinage and the circulation patterns. 6. Economic history. A die corpus can be used to understand the economic history of the period, such as the trade patterns and the wealth of the issuer. 7. Political history. A die corpus can be used to understand the political history of the period, such as the succession of rulers, the wars, and the rebellions. 8. Artistic history. A die corpus can be used to understand the artistic history of the period, such as the iconography, the symbolism, and the style.
Then I got interrupted, so I asked ChatGPT where we were up to.
We were discussing die studies, a technique used in numismatics, the study of coins, to understand the process of striking coins by cataloging the impressions made by the dies on surviving coins. I provided a list of historical interpretations that numismatists can make from a die corpus, such as production quantity, chronology, monetary policy, mint organization, regional variations, economic and political history, and artistic history. Is there anything else you would like to know?
Note that final phrase, anything I want to know. I'm teaching ChatGPT here. It isn't teaching me anything. In fact, this is such a feature I was picking up on, I set the bot up with the next question and asked, the techniques in dye studies are usually divided into 3 parts: meta-dye analysis, inter-dye analysis, and intra-dye analysis. What do you think these 3 terms mean?
Meta-dye analysis refers to the study of the dyes themselves, rather than the coins they struck. This would include examination of the dyes for signs of wear, signs of reuse, or signs of repair. Inter-dye analysis refers to the study of the relationship between dyes. This would include determining the chronological order of dye production, determining if dyes were made by the same engraver, or determining if dyes were used in the same workshop or mint. Intra-dye analysis refers to the study of the relationship between the individual coins struck by a dye. This would include determining the order in which a dye was used, determining if a dye was used to strike more than one denomination or metal, or determining if a dye was used to strike more than one obverse or reverse. So, in summary, meta-dye analysis examines the dyes themselves. Inter-dye analysis examines the relationship between the dyes, and intra-dye analysis examines the relationship between the coins struck by a dye.
That is correct for inter-dye and intra-dye. Meta-dye analysis refers to the examination of the dyes statistically, so the whole corpus of dyes. The most common use of meta-dye analysis is to try and estimate the production of coins. I think this is a good point to stop and give some commentary. Obviously, we have that weird thing again, where meta-dye analysis is a phrase, but ChatGPT tries to break it down into its individual components and build a definition up from those, which, as we discussed when it made the same mistake with dye studies, is not how language works. But it doesn't do that with inter-dye or intra-dye, both of which it defines correctly, by essentially pulling fairly standard definitions out of numismatic literature. But here is why I set that question up. I created, or probably more accurately, named and formalised this distinction over a decade ago, and that makes this a fairly clear-cut case of mansplaining. I am not the first person to comment on ChatGPT's tendency to mansplain. Plenty of other people have made the point, and I don't just mean it's arrogant. If you have not read Rebecca Solnit's essay, Men Explain Things to Me, you absolutely should. It begins with an anecdote in which a man asks about her work, and she mentions the subject of the book she has recently written, at which point the man attempts to explain to her, based on a review of a book he had not read, what the book is about, apparently entirely oblivious of the gulf in expertise, or, more likely, making an unwarranted assumption that the gulf in expertise is the opposite of what it actually was. Everyone who's ever done research has had this experience. I've had this experience. Why do we call it mansplaining, if this happens to every researcher? Well, it happens to me very occasionally, but every female colleague I've ever spoken to has a list of incidents so long they've lost track of how many times, and almost everybody that does this is a man. Note, I'm using mansplaining here in a rather specific sense, and not simply as a synonym of condescending, because English already has a perfectly good word to indicate condescension with overtones of patriarchal culture, and that word is patronising. I personally feel no need to create a synonym for a widely used word, and in the process deprive myself of a terminology so delightfully and perfectly encapsulates what ChatGPT is doing. ChatGPT is taking terms I introduced to the study of die striking about a decade or two ago and explaining them back to me like it is teaching me how to do it, in a context in which we have already clearly established I'm tempted to say he, does not understand or know a lot about the subject, and I am in fact an expert. And yes, that is definitely mansplaining.
But, and I think I should stick up for the computer, not everything ChatGPT does is mansplaining. Sometimes, like in its initial answer, it is just being arrogant. It has no way to know at the start of the conversation how much Robert does or doesn't know. And, while its answer to what numismatics is might come across as condescending or patronizing, where it starts waxing on the subject of dyes studies, it wouldn't be fair to call it mansplaining, or critique it too harshly for the patronizing tone. It is just trying to contextualize its answer based on previous questions. And it does show a remarkable degree of humility whenever it is corrected, in a way no human speaking with that unwarranted level of self-confidence ever would. And that curious mixture of both being condescending and humble, as it is both very knowledgeable and at the same time quite dim, is its most inhuman feature.
Anyway, with that off my chest, let's get back to the transcript. The most common use of metadata analysis is to try and estimate the production of coins. Why do we think we need this complicated technique to estimate how many coins were made?
ChatGPT gives a long answer here, which doesn't really answer Robert's question, but rather just puts what metadata analysis is in its own terms. I'm not going to read it all out. It's on the screen if you care that much. In summary, metadata analysis is a complex technique that allows numismatists to gather detailed information about the dies used to strike a coinage and use that information to make inferences about the production process, including the production quantity, mint organization, and monetary policy.
Good. In theory, we could use the wear on the dies. That would be a type of intra-die analysis. I mistyped here and wrote inter-die to estimate how long dies were used for, but in the current state of our knowledge, we're not able to do that. Experimental archaeology, famous numismatists in this field include David Selwood and Thomas Faucher, have used experiments to try and estimate how many coins an individual die makes, but the results are still very uncertain. Why do you think we use such a complex material culture technique rather than simply looking at textual records? So here I've treated it like a human student. I've given some encouragement, some more information, with a few typos, and essentially restated the same question it did not answer.
Numismatics is a field of material culture, meaning it studies objects, in this case, coins. Textual records, such as government documents, invoices, or ledgers, may not always be available or reliable for various reasons, such as lost records, incomplete records, or biased records. Therefore, the examination of surviving coins through die studies provides an alternative and complementary way to gather information about the past. It allows for a more accurate understanding of the production and circulation of coins, which can provide insight into economic, political, and social aspects of a society. Additionally, die studies also allow for the identification of forgeries and the detection of counterfeiting, which can help prevent fraud and protect the integrity of the historical record.
Those are all reasons, but the main one is lost or incomplete records. In general, we use die studies for periods when few records survive. For example, in ancient Greece, hundreds of different states, a Greek state is often referred to as a polis, made coins, but the only set of surviving accounts are those for the Amphictyonic League, recorded in an inscription at Delphi.
Exactly. The main reason to use die studies is to fill in the gaps in historical records, particularly for ancient and medieval periods, where records are often scarce or non-existent. Coins, as durable objects, have a better chance of surviving over time and therefore can provide valuable information about a society's economy, politics, and social dynamics. Die studies can also help to identify historical patterns, such as changes in coin production over time, or the emergence of new mints, which can provide insight into broader historical trends. Additionally, die studies can also help to authenticate coins, which can be important for collectors and museums, and can also help to prevent fraud and protect the integrity of historical records.
However, reconstructing changes in coin production over time through die studies can be very difficult. What steps do you think are involved in making an estimate of coin production from a die corpus?
Making an estimate of coin production from a die corpus can be a complex and challenging task for numismatists. Some steps that may be involved in this process include 1. Collecting and cataloging a representative sample of coins from the die corpus. 2. Examining the coins for evidence of die wear, such as cracks, chips, and other signs of damage to the dies. 3. Estimating the length of time that each die was used based on the degree of wear. 4. Comparing the relative frequency of different dies in the corpus to estimate the total number of coins produced by each die. 5. using statistical methods to estimate the total number of coins produced by the mint over a specific period of time, based on the estimated production of each die. 6. Comparing the estimates of coin production with other historical records and archaeological evidence, such as trade records, inscriptions, and other artifacts, to validate the estimates and to gain a broader understanding of the coinage and economic history of the period in question. It's important to keep in mind that this process is not easy and might require a lot of time and resources. Also, it's important to note that die studies are not the only way to estimate coin production. Other methods, such as metallurgical analysis or archaeology, can also be used.
Not bad. There are essentially 4 steps. First, you have to collect the coins for a die corpus. Well done, you got that. Then you need to estimate, using statistical methods from the corpus, how many dies originally existed. The most popular method for that was developed by Giles Carter and Warren Esty, based on data from the coins of a Roman moneyer, Crepuscius, and a compilation of Greek die studies made by François de Callatay. Once you have an estimate of the number of dies, you need to know how many coins each die made. That is still a problem numismatists have not solved. And finally, the 4th step is to work out how the production relates to coins in circulation. For example, if a mint takes in large numbers of coins and strikes new coins from the metal, it might make a lot of coins, but not change the numbers that are circulating. Try putting those 4 stages in your own words.
The process of estimating coin production from a die corpus involves 4 steps. First, collecting a large number of coins to form a die corpus. Second, using statistical methods to estimate the number of dies that were originally used to make the coins. Third, determining the number of coins that each die produced, which is still a challenging task for numismatists. Finally, understanding how the production relates to the coins in circulation, taking into account factors such as restriking and melting of coins.
It is genuinely good at this, putting things in its own words. It is something human students often struggle with, but ChatGPT excels at. So now I'm going to switch to another technique. Excellent, I think you've done very well. I'm going to ask a few questions to test your understanding. Is that okay?
Yes, that's fine. I will do my best to answer them accurately.
In which field of study would someone use a die study?
Die studies are used in the field of numismatics, which is the study of coins, tokens, and paper money, and the history of their production and circulation.
Excellent. It is possible to tell if 2 ancient coins were made using the same or different tools, dies, because of what feature?
Because of the variations in the design of the coin, as the dies used to make ancient coins were often hand-engraved, each die is slightly different from the others. So the design on the coins can be used to tell if 2 coins were made using the same or different dies.
Perfect. Dies break over time because the process involves a lot of mechanical stresses. What is our main source of evidence for how many coins a die would make? And how many coins might you typically expect a pair of dies to make? This is a tough question. It's worth saying what I might expect of human students. My expectation is most human students would look at me blankly here. Since I've not covered this directly at any point up to now, they just wouldn't be able to make a reasonable inference and would not know how to answer. But a very bright student, I think, would probably give me something close to the correct answer. ChatGPT doesn't do either of these.
Our main source of evidence for how many coins a die would make is the number of coins that survive that were struck by that die.
That first sentence is wrong in a very inhuman and peculiar way. We know how many coins are made by looking at how many coins were made. When humans fall into circular reasoning, it's usually more subtle than this, but ChatGPT seems to have some very serious limitations any time it has to engage with reasoning. Anyway, I help it out with the correct answer. Our main source of evidence is experimental archaeology and comparisons of die studies with rare surviving records.
As for the number of coins a die might make, it can vary widely depending on factors such as the quality of the die, the skill of the engraver, the technology used to strike the coins, and the overall production rate at the mint. Typically, a pair of dies could make anywhere from a few hundred to tens of thousands of coins before they needed to be replaced.
Much better. One last question. If I have two coins and both were made with the same reverse die but using different obverse dies, would you think it more likely that A, they were made at the same mint, or B, they were made at different mints? Again, this is another one where I've given enough information to infer a reasonable answer, but have not previously explained the answer. But this is much easier. I would expect most students to get this one. Take a moment, pause the video if you want, and don't just think about which answer you think is correct, but why. What would your line of reasoning be?
A. They were made in the same mint. It is likely that the mint had a set of common reverse dies that were used for a period of time, and different obverse dies were used for individual issues or moneyers.
Not bad at all. You're quite a good student. No point in bashing a student at the end of the lesson, but did you notice that while ChatGPT got the right answer, the reasoning it offered made no sense? It seems to have just smashed together different things people tend to say when broadly discussing mint organisation without really understanding any underlying logic. A sort of these words belong together approach.
What did you expect? It told you at the start it was a statistical language model.
That is a fair point. I suppose before I gave it a try, I was wondering if ChatGPT would come across as a very dim human being. But it doesn't. It can occasionally sound quite human. One of my colleagues told it that its information on a historical figure was wrong, and after it apologised and said it was a common misinterpretation, they tried to ask it to cite who made this error, and it refused, constantly insisting it was a common misinterpretation. It wasn't. In exactly the way I can imagine an obstinate student, in fact in exactly the same way I have seen obstinate students do. But in general, ChatGPT is very inhuman in its responses. The mixture of humility and arrogance, the general tone, its apparently enormous knowledge, its ability to learn, adapt its response, reframe, but at the same time, its remarkable lack of ability to reason, its weird reconstruction of phrases by breaking them down into individual words. It can connect ideas, but it seems to be entirely unable to work with them. Anyway, I found it a fascinating experience and a very impressive tool. I can even see some potential utility, and I wanted to share it. So thank you to Isa for helping me make that possible, and thank you for listening.